All right, so today we're going to talk about future tense, and I want to focus on will and going to, but I'm going to talk about it in an unorthodox fashion. I'm an academic. I like grammar. I've studied grammar. I believe it's important to use the language properly, but I think in some instances, the grammar rules have produced a very convoluted understanding of how we express ourselves most of the time. Convoluted means unclear. Convolute, convoluted, a great word. And we're going to look at a few different truths that I think you want to be aware of as we move through this. Truth number one, whether you use will or going to or present continuous, which is obviously going to is part of that, it's almost always understood by the listener. And many or most of the time, it's probably even correct. So this is what's interesting, is that when you're using the future tense, whether it's will, whether it's going to, or some other form of the present continuous, it's always going to be understood, but there might be a few instances where one version is more natural than another. But I think this alternative of just using a future tense is probably preferred than to trying to memorize all of these antiquated rules. And I'll talk about these rules. But I think this is what you need to understand if you're a speaker of English. Now, not if you're a teacher. I'll deal with teaching aspects later. But if you're trying to learn how to use a future tense, if you're speaking and using the language as a second language learner, I think using any of the above is going to produce the desired effect that you're talking about the future. Now, obviously, present continuous must be used carefully. Is going to is obviously a future construction, but other present continuous uses must be used along a sort of grammatical understanding. But with will, not really. It's always the future. Secondly, this is really important, and I had a discussion even last weekend. Native speakers rarely hear a distinction in meaning between will and going to. Very rarely. And there's none of the sort of niceties, we call these details, that you find in grammar books, most grammar books. Native speakers don't feel these differences. They're not used and understood in this way in natural language. And so you need to know this. And I'll give you some examples of exactly what I mean now. If you have questions, write them in the box below and I will answer them near the end. So I assume there might be some questions on this. So native speakers don't have this great distinction in most cases. In some cases there are. In most cases there are not. Look at this, for example. I'll be seeing him tomorrow. I'm going to see him tomorrow. I'll see him tomorrow. I'm seeing him tomorrow. I see him tomorrow. In all of these instances, we have a different construction with will or present continuous, or I'm going to see him tomorrow. We have that number 2. All of these different constructions, and they all basically mean the same thing. There's no distinction from a native speaker perspective in any of these sentences, except perhaps the last one. I see him tomorrow might mean that it's a regular sort of meeting. But with all other instances, there's no difference. With a native speaker, I don't feel any difference in the first 5. The first 5, I don't feel a difference. We just know that tomorrow you're meeting him. That's it. So all of these little distinctions you read about in grammar books, they don't exist amongst native speakers. So all of the first 5 here the first 4, 1, 2, 3, the first 4 mean exactly the same. Number 5 could mean The same, or it could mean a pattern that every week or every day you see them. So that is what I want. That's the big lesson today, is that we as native speakers do not feel or understand a difference between the first 4 sentences, certainly. Will be seeing, will see, I'm going to see, no difference. There's nothing about premeditated, planned, predetermined, on the calendar, not scheduled. None of that we feel. We just know that tomorrow we will be meeting somebody. All right, let's look at a few more examples to make my point, and I'm borrowing these from examples I've seen on the internet. They are going to wear this uniform tomorrow. They will wear this uniform tomorrow. There's no difference in meaning for most native speakers. We don't feel a difference. There's no, it's certain or uncertain, planned or unplanned. There's none of that meaning in these sentences. They mean the same thing when native speakers use them. So if you have a different intention by them, the native speaker will not pick that up. They understand both of these sentences as a sort of in a natural understanding, without any, motive behind it or predetermined action. Let's look at another example to make my point. I imagine the theater will be full on Friday. I imagine the theater is going to be full. I could use both, and I mean the exact same thing. I don't feel a difference if I use will or is going to be. I don't feel a difference. And I know that other native speakers don't feel a difference either. And so this is the point, I'm going to repeat it a few times, that I want to get across, that there is not a big difference in most uses of either of these terms. Let's see if we have any more examples. I think we might even have one more here. 2 more. Liverpool's players are known to be skilled. They will win the match easily. They are going to win the match. I could say both of these sentences and mean the same. For me, it's I think they're going to win. That's what I mean by that statement. They will win. They're going to win. I could use both. And I mean the same, or if I heard both, I would understand the same. That person feels they are going to win, that Liverpool will win the match. If you're a well-organized person, you manage your time, you will manage your time. Again, there's no real big difference. I might say manage, you manage your time. Stylistically, it's more natural for me to say you manage your time, maybe without will, but that's a slightly different example, I suppose. And let's move on to another idea that maybe you want to keep in mind. I borrowed this from Michael Swan. I haven't assessed it empirically, but it seems to make sense. Will is the basic structure for talking about the future. So if you're ever confused about which form to use for the future, opt for will. Choose will. That's the most natural construction because that is the construction for future tense. We use will if there is not a good reason for using present forms. I think that's a very good piece of advice. If you're unclear what to do, use will, and you'll almost always be correct. Now, let me just say one thing. There will be occasions, and maybe you'll ask a question about this later, where you might use will or going to, and the other one sounds unnatural, a bit unnatural. That can happen. And that's where I think with practice, with speaking a lot and getting around the language a lot by listening, watching movies or clips and listening to the language, you will start to feel which is slightly better and which is preferred. But I'm suggesting that if you try to memorize the rules surrounding will and going to, it will leave you confused because it's very difficult to distinguish. And here's how normally will and going to are taught, or whether it's arranged or planned, what the intention is, whether the prediction is based on evidence, whether I know it internally or whether the evidence is external. This is so confusing and not very helpful. I realize it's the best we've got, but I'm suggesting, and others, it's not me, this is not my idea, but others are suggesting that there's a simpler way to do this, which is perhaps not bother with most of this and just use either will or going to, almost indiscriminately. And as you accrue experience, accrue is a great word, ACCRUE, as you accrue or gain experience, then you start to understand which phrase is preferred for that given situation. A timetable, whether it's in the schedule, on the schedule or not. Again, these are really difficult to determine for non-natives. And for natives, we don't even think about these things. We just speak in a very natural way, the way we were sort of brought up. All right. I hope that doesn't rock the grammar boat too much. This is a little bit controversial and normally not my style, but I feel that sometimes when rules impede understanding or impede fluency, I think the rules on future tense often do. Last week I talked about particular circumstances to use present tense. I think that can be helpful a little bit, but when trying to determine between will and going to, I'm not sure the rules are very helpful. Here we have an example. We're going to meet Sandra at 6. We will meet Sandra at 6. We're going to meet Sandra at 6. Actually, the 1 and 3 are the same. We're meeting, we're going to meet, and we will meet. 3 different forms of the future. And for the native speaker, there's no difference. No one, I suggest, I think no one that I know would say, oh, we will or we're going to. Which one? I want to know if you've determined the meeting already, planned it or not. Nobody thinks like that. If you said any of these, we would understand that tomorrow you have a meeting with Sandra at 6. However that arrangement is made, you will meet her at 6. And so the suggestion that I think some of the writers of English, of the sort of contextual grammar would suggest, is that you use structures and examples until you feel them natural to the ear. In other words, exposing yourself to the language and then adopting some of these styles will give you a sort of intuition on which to use. And obviously that's not going to satisfy those who are very perfectionists dealing with grammar, and I understand that. And I also understand, because I write professionally, that you have to get the style right. I understand that. But for speaking and most uses of my audience, it's not critical. As you get to higher levels of the language, then you can start to think about, which one is slightly better or slightly more natural. But I think in the beginning, using any future tense to convey a future tense event is going to be appropriate. It might not always be the most natural, but I don't think wasting hours of time studying rules that honestly aren't very clear is a good use of our time. Now, I realize that some of you will not agree with me on that, and I'm willing to be criticized and take a lot of flack. If you take a lot of flack, that means you take a lot of criticism. Flack, I received a lot of flack, F-L-A-C-K, means I received a lot of criticism. I might receive a lot of flack for that statement. All right, I want to see, this is an exceedingly short meeting today. I wonder if this is it. So my suggestion would be to learn the basic structures, which are not difficult for future. Will plus the base, the stem of the verb, So we have will run, will hide, or is going to. These are very easy structures to sort of, to put together. And then understanding basic structures of how to compose future tense, and then just practicing and learning which ones are more natural would be my suggestion for most learners, except those aspiring to the very highest levels where you need to be a little bit more specific. All right, I think we're nearly finished.